The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are joining us from. My name is Wendy Wilkes, and I'm a Senior Policy Analyst with the Association of State Drinking Water Administrators. I want to thank everybody for joining us on this Good Friday for a webinar on predictive tools for lead service line inventories. I have a few introductory and housekeeping slides before we get started. So for the uninitiated, a quick background on ASDWA. Our mission is to provide information, opportunities, and guidance to state and federal leaders, as well as partners in the drinking water sector, to protect public health and the environment. Our members are the Drinking Water Program administrators from the 50 states, 5 territories, the Navajo Nation, and the District of Columbia, who provide public water system oversight through regulation, technical assistance, and funding. Lead service lines have caused increasing concerns around the impacts of lead contamination on public health and continue to be a major contributor of lead in drinking water. The lead and copper rule is currently being modified by EPA, and utilities are beginning to prioritize the removal of widespread and long-standing lead infrastructure in their systems. Developing a lead service line replacement program requires an accurate lead service line inventory. With many utilities starting with incomplete records, predictive tools and analysis can help build on the inventory of lead service lines in their service area. Today's webinar provides attendees with the opportunity to learn about state and utility experience with these predictive tools. I do want to mention that this webinar is in partnership with the Lead Service Line Replacement Collaborative, which is a group that seeks to provide resources and tools for initiating and implementing full lead service line replacement. And I'm very happy to see many of the collaborative's members are joining us today for the webinar. We have 3 wonderful presentations lined up for you today. We'll start with the great state of Michigan with a presentation on Michigan's experience with lead service line inventory predictive tools. Eric Oswald from Michigan's Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, or EGLE as it's fondly referred to, will talk about the issues from the state regulatory perspective. And then we'll turn it over to Eric Schwartz from Blue Conduit and the University of Michigan to expand on the methodology and technologies used in Michigan. Next, we'll have Karine Molick with AECOM talk about their ongoing work with Denver Water to build and implement a lead service line inventory predictive model and prioritize lead service line replacement. And finally, we have Erica Walker with 120 Water to discuss their lead service line probability finder and predictive intelligence module. We'll then have a round out the webinar with a Q&A session for all of our panelists. Speaking of question and answers, please type in your questions into the question box on your webinar control panel. There's no need to wait to send them in until the end of the webinar. I have been deputized as moderator for the Q&A session, so I'll be collecting your questions throughout the webinar to pose to our panelists at the conclusion of their presentations. And as a reminder, now is a great time to close other programs such as email or messenger applications to reduce buffering and ensure a quality experience during this webinar. And this webinar will be so good, you might want to view it twice. Lucky for you, we're recording this, and a recording of the webinar will be made available for viewing on ASDWA's website, probably early next week. You'll be able to find the recording under the Events tab if you choose webinar recordings. With that, we are on to the main event, and I will go ahead and turn over control to Eric Oswald with Michigan EGLE.
Okay, so I'm assuming I've got control and you can see my screen now.
Okay, I think I just sent it over.
Okay.
All right, you're up and ready to go.
All right, so very good. So as Wendy mentioned, I'm Eric Oswald. I'm the director of the Drinking Water and Environmental Health Division at Michigan's Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy. And I'm going to speak a little bit about our experience with lead service line inventories in the state. And then I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Eric Schwartz of Blue Conduit, who's going to go into more of their predictive tools that they've used. They've had a lot of experience in the city of Flint, and elsewhere in the state. So without further ado, just what I'm going to go over here is a little bit of background on the lead and copper rule in Michigan and the inventory requirements. The results of our preliminary inventory that was due on the 1st of January of this year, and then future inventories. So Michigan's lead and copper rule was revised substantially, and it became effective in June of 2018. Here's some summary of the major changes, but it highlighted there is a requirement for a materials inventory for all our community and non-transient, non-community water systems in the state. And obviously that materials inventory feeds directly into the service line replacement requirements that we have this kick in 2021. So here's a real quick overview of implementation dates. As you can see there, the preliminary, what we're calling a distribution system materials inventory, was due on the 1st of January 2020. And what we're calling a verified or validated distribution system materials inventory is due on January 1st of 2025. So the systems now have basically 5 years to refine and verify their system inventories. So here's the, we'll go into the distribution material inventory system in the state of Michigan. See if I can get another slide up here. So we decided to go with a two-step process on the inventory. The first step was a preliminary inventory that basically boils down to getting a system to tell us what they know about their distribution system materials. Again, some have a very good inventory, some know exactly what's out there, some have no clue what's out there, quite frankly. We had a lot of systems in the 1990s that got enough of an inventory to create their sampling pools, and they stopped there. You know, it kind of primes the pump for us to get ready on the verified inventory and gets a good idea of what they know and what they don't know. The validated inventory, and we're still working on guidelines for that, is the best effort to identify all lead service lines. And not only that, but we're asking for a complete inventory on the distribution system. So water mains, everything else will have to be included on that. And again, we're still developing tools for that. We did implement a $9 million pilot project to 18 cities throughout the state to remove lead service lines and to work on their inventories. And we're still developing lessons learned from that pilot project. So that is still ongoing. So what you can see here is kind of a pictorial representation of what we were going to do. And again, the first step was to get systems to identify basically it's going to identify what they don't know in their system, what they do know, what they don't know. And then step 2 there, as you see, is a fill in the blank kind of thing to have them show us or fill in what the information that's lacking. So when we started doing the preliminary, we had a form. It's out on our website, and I'll have links at the end of this presentation to our websites and all the information that's out there. This is the form that we sent out. It's a 3-page form. This is the first page, and it kind of shows you how simple we tried to make this. So you can see down there that they have boxes to check in with numbers and then to add it up. So very simple form for them to fill out and send us the information, which we got from most of them on the 1st of January of this year. So in trying to identify where the lead is, this is kind of what we use on the public side. And again, I'll have another screenshot of the form later on here, but water main records, tax records, look where your system upgrades were. We actually have plumbing codes that actually required lead in some cases, and then others that outlawed the use of lead. So we looked at, had them look at those and get dates of when things were installed and use that to determine where lead might be and where it shouldn't be. Staff knowledge and field investigations. On the private side, because Michigan's new lead and copper rule requires the utilities to remove the entire lead service line, including the private side, that introduced a little more of a variable and a little more sophistication into the system here, because they have to determine what's on the private side as well. So they're looking at tax records, plumbing codes, surveying the homeowners, and having actual visual inspections when they go in to do service on a water meter, something like that. We'll have them take pictures actually of the line coming into the home. This is right off the form. So this is kind of the things we're asking them to take a look at when they're trying to determine where the lead in the system is. So you can see some of the same information that we had before. So here are the results that we got on the 1st of January of this year. You can see we had about, let me get to my notes here. We had about 100,000 lead service lines that were known lead. We had an additional 21,000 that were galvanized that were previously connected to lead, and we consider those lead service lines as well. And then we had another 177,000 that they didn't know but were likely lead. So if you look on the pie chart, there's that area there that we think is going to be our lead service lines. Now you have this other area of about 277,000 lines that they just don't have a clue what they are. And then you've got the unknowns down here in the blue that are about 560,000 that are unknown, but they don't believe they're likely to contain lead. So that kind of puts that in a nutshell. It's important to note that the data set isn't complete yet. And again, this is noted, all this information is on our website. We didn't release the data for approximately 200 of our supplies because we had to review it because the numbers just weren't adding up. And then we had another about 100 supplies that haven't submitted their report yet. So we're going to be going after them to get their information. But as you can see, we've got about 1.3 million that we're pretty sure service line material is not lead. So here's some online resources. We've put a lot of work into this MI Lead Safe website. We're very proud of that. We worked with our Department of Health and Human Services as they have a drinking water unit there as well as Eagle. So we work cooperatively and work together on this website that has just a plethora of information. And it also has lead results from all the communities in the state. And then again, you've got our websites for Eagle. We've got our drinking water, our LCR page, and then public advisory. And then again, Michigan has our drinking water revolving fund is out there as well. I wanted to provide some contacts. These are the people that work the day-to-day programs, Brandon Onan and Jenny Bolt. So if you want to get a hold of them, they're aware that I'm sharing their information, so don't be afraid to shoot them an email or give them a call. If you want to pick their brains about the system inventories and the pitfalls and lessons learned that we've had. Holly Golke down here works exclusively with schools. She has just an immense amount of experience working with schools and lead testing in schools and putting out publications to principals and working with schools to identify and then mitigate lead exposure in schools. So I put her information up there as well for you. And with that, that's my obligatory Michigan Eagle follow-up slide that I have to put in, but I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Eric Schwartz, who works with Blue Conduit. They had a lot of experience in Flint and were very successful in identifying for the city where they can expect to find lead service lines. And that predictive model was borne out by the actual replacement of all the lead service lines in the city of Flint. So with that, Eric, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Eric. I appreciate it, Eric Oswald, and I'm happy to jump right in with my screen. You probably can't see it yet, can you? But I will, can tell we're all good now. So thank you to ASWA and to Eagle and all the other participants for being here and contributing. We are really excited to be talking about service line predictive technologies. As Eric Oswald was saying, back in 2016 is when we started the team that eventually became Blue Conduit. And we really do say that we are looking to use machine learning, artificial intelligence to reduce uncertainty of inventory and replacement for service lines. And I'll get into a bit more of the team in a bit, but here's who we are. Our mission is to protect public health and reduce that uncertainty around service lines. And we really are coming from a social mission perspective. This was started here at the University of Michigan, where I'm also a full-time professor. Jake Abernathy, my co-founder, also was a professor here at the time and now at Georgia Tech. So we developed predictive methods. My expertise is in data science, in customer analytics. Jake's expertise is also in machine learning for a good 15 years. So both of us do this professionally in our other careers. And when 2016 happened, we met Brigadier General Mike McDaniel from the National Guard, who was retired at the time, running this program at Flint to actually implement and execute the entire service line replacement program in Flint. And the three of us, plus a couple of former students of ours, were able to really work together and manage this mix of data and logistics and public health concern all around lead service lines. And that's what Eric Oswald was referring to. So I'll tell you a bit about that and how we've grown from that, because based on that experience, we've started Blue Conduit. General Mike McDaniel is on board, as a few other team members, with the purpose of spreading this to other municipalities. And we've already worked with a total across 20 municipalities in different utilities. This is based on published research, award-winning research in machine learning conferences, and based on this predictive modeling. And I want to really just be brief here, since I'm digging into some of Eric Oswald's time, but I want to just let you have these 5 takeaways. I'll step through each of these 5 points one by one, so I can go in detail. But from the top, we're going to talk about the old data and why it's not perfect, what a great first step that we were able to do in Flint and now elsewhere to get a kind of supercharge the value of that data and get a representative sample of inspections. From there, connecting that data with all of the existing data and the inspections and other buildings and permits, and then from there to build the model and think about the predictive model as just another information layer to support decisions that are going to look for you to get the biggest return on your investment in terms of public. And then finally, this is a complex problem that will vary system to system and certainly state to state. And so what we've been advocating for is a set of criteria based on commonly agreed upon principles. And this has been the kinds of things that we're putting out have been accepted by Eagle and the EPA from Flint. And I understand some of the other states represented here have started to accept predictive models. So to the first, we recognize that the old service line records have mixed reliability and large gaps. I'm not saying they're completely wrong all the time. In fact, they can be somewhat useful. However, the way to really see that is to quantify how useful they are by comparing those historical records to the verified materials, so that you can make statements like, of all of the records we have saying copper, 20% of them actually ended up having some lead in some portion of the service line. And that may differ from neighborhood to neighborhood. And in one neighborhood of the city, that might be 20. In another neighborhood of the city, it might be 1%. And so appreciating the records differ, and the way that they differ might in fact vary. So what do you do when all you have is these old records and maybe a handful of water main replacements during which you have seen the service line materials and recorded them, as many states and water systems have in different states? Well, the first idea in statistics when you're trying to make some sort of judgment or inference about a whole population is get a representative sample. And so we have been able to, in Flint, inspected a set of service lines locations that were reflective of the whole system. And we are able to do that by actually selecting a semi-randomized group where every single service line had an equal chance, approximately equal chance of being selected. And we were able to do that. And the reason that became so critical was before that, the historical 10 to 20% of the city had lead. But then in the very first 170 service line replacements attempts, 96% had lead. And so the question was, well, surely the team went to a zone that they knew had lead in those 170. And so the system-wide, city-wide, the probability probably wasn't 10 or 20%. It probably wasn't 96%. And so with the representative sample, we were able to, just after a few hundred inspections, in this case, they were using hydrovac at 2 different points on the service line to verify the material on both portions. We actually saw that about 50% of the city had lead, at least on some portion, lead or galvanized. And I want to be clear, that's in 2016. And so 20,000 excavations and homes visited later, the total proportion of Flint homes that ended up having lead or galvanized ended up being about that 50%. And this kind of early information was used by General McDaniel and the state agency and the EPA for planning purposes and communication to the public. What does it mean to connect these data sets? Well, this is really the data we're talking about. And when we talk, we want to be, as we were in Flint and are going forward, we want to show how you can be really transparent about what is happening under the hood. Here's the kind of data that we were using, kind of the data that you would imagine, but here's how it's laid out. Importantly, you can see there are different columns for the private or the customer owned versus a public or utility owned portion. But the basic idea of a predictive model is just to fill in the blanks on the left-hand side in those purple columns. So where we haven't yet confirmed the materials, we're going to put some probabilities. And the actual algorithms and the choice of model may not matter as much as getting a bunch of these principles right. And we can throw all the fanciest machine learning or statistical algorithms at them, but if the data isn't structured and organized properly, it's not going to be as effective. And this work is based off of the research that we did. You can see Abernathy et al. From 2018. And so what does that actually look like? What do I mean by an extra layer to support predictions and decisions? Well, at every home, we've got a probability before anyone has dug up the street or the lawn at that home, or even inspected inside the home, the likelihood of lead. And this can be used, as we've worked with the city of Flint and now other utilities, to be aggregated at different ways. So for planning, you probably want to know, well, I want to send my trucks to that street or that block or that segment of the water main, so we know if we may have to also coordinate a water main replacement with all the service lines, or maybe a whole neighborhood to coordinate logistics, or even a whole water system for reporting. Once you have these probabilities and predictions at the household or at the service line level, you can ask any of these questions and provide estimates. This also allows us to figure out where we should send inspection crews, because where you send replacement crews may not necessarily be the exact same places where you send an inspection crew later. And the punchline is, this works. It worked. It worked in Flint. What you can see in green is every month that we were involved in the program in green, and in purple are months that we were not involved in the program. And in green, we were working in the first portion in 2016 and 17. General Mike McDaniel was in charge. They were using our predictive model as best as they could. It was going well, and they were finding about 80% lead. So out of every dig with the intention of replacing lead, or replacing a service line that was lead, they found it 80% of the time. Unfortunately, through a variety of circumstances, another firm took over, and we weren't involved at the end, starting in 2018, all of 2018, and you can see their hit rate really dropped. They were only finding, out of about 11,000 digs, they only found about 1,500. So 15%. Now, what ends up being quite a nice story at the end was, thanks to a court order that was instituted by a federal court in Michigan, we actually were then required, the city, to work with us and use the predictive model. So the city of Flint in 2019 returned to using it, and through all of 2019, that hit rate returned to around 70, 60%, just where we would expect it to be. And finally, to really close here, I want to talk about the general principles, because we're not trying to hide any black box here. We're trying to really advocate for a lot of transparency when it comes to statistics and putting the best practices and established practices forward. So here's a set of criteria. It's not all encompassing, but it's a pretty strong set to think about. Accuracy needs to be evaluated with data different than the data that was used to build the predictive model. That's sometimes called out of sample or holdout data. Representation. You need to have representative samples of the whole system to ensure that you have a full picture of the system when you're running these models. And transparency and reproducibility, so that the data and methods could be made available so that others could do a form of this analysis. Especially if this is being done in the public sphere, in the public domain, it's really important to think about that these are independent of the particular choice of methods, but just based on years and decades of good statistical practice. And with that, I'll close and say thank you. You can see the team here: Jake, myself, General McDaniel, Jared Webb is the chief data scientist, and Ian Robinson, who's really running the show. So I'd encourage anyone, if you have any questions, we're happy to talk more about our experience in Flint, in Michigan, in other states, and more about the research and more about Blue Conduit. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Eric. I'm going to go ahead and switch the presentation over to Corrine. As I'm doing that, I do want to remind everybody that the question box is open. I've seen several roll through, so it's shaping up to be a nice Q&A, but just a reminder to keep those questions coming in. And with that, I will turn it over to Corrine.
All right, thank you very much. I'm just going to go full screen here. And I'm assuming you can see it. Before I get too far, I really want to acknowledge the team that's been working on this for Denver Water. Alexis Woodrow is the program manager for Denver Water and is doing a fantastic job leading us. And when I say a team effort, I really do mean a team effort. So Corona Environmental built the initial model, and Mott McDonald helped with advancing that inventory, I should say the initial inventory. And then it was my colleagues at AECOM that helped to take that inventory and make it into a predictive model and a prioritization tool. So about a year ago, I was I presented at the same organization. And at that time, I was talking about desktop tools that are useful and effective for building an initial inventory. And we talked a lot about trade-offs, the level of effort involved with the quality of the result that came from that. I did mention predictive modeling at the time, and I'm going to focus on that today. And it's probably one of the more sophisticated tools that we use to try and build an inventory. So why did we use a predictive model to build the inventory for Denver Water? And we knew once the initial inventory was built that there were statistics that told us the likelihood of finding lead in the system, but those statistics don't tell us exactly where the lead can be found. And so this is why we're talking about this today in terms of how we can use the predictive model both to help a water utility find the lead, but also to replace it, and also to tell the story to the public in terms of what the water system is doing, why are we going to one neighborhood to another. And this is just a screenshot of the actual inventory that is posted to Denver Water's website. So quick overview of Denver Water. It was founded in 1918, and they now serve a population of 1.4 million people. They have 3,000 miles of pipe and approximately 350,000 service connections. There's obviously no lead in the water delivered to the customer, and the lead is coming from the customer-owned service line, as well as any leaded plumbing inside of the home or lead solder. Corrosion control is provided by pH adjustment at approximately in the mid-8s, and that's to treat an alpine reservoir water. So in the summer of 2019, I should say, Denver Water was developing their lead reduction program plan, and an instrumental part of that plan was documenting that where the lead was and how the presence of lead would inform how we did or carried out the various elements of the program. The variance request was prepared as an alternative for using orthophosphate for corrosion control, and it was built on a holistic approach of identifying the different sources of lead and the communities affected by those sources of lead to come up with this overall lead reduction program. So that's why you see on the right-hand side of the screen, we're talking about building an inventory. We're talking about replacing the lead for those members of the community that have lead services. We're talking about corrosion control treatment for those members of the community that have lead solder and won't have a lead service to replace. And we're talking about a filter program so that we can manage the risk of lead exposure until the time at which the lead service can be replaced. And throughout all of this, or encompassing all of these elements, is the need for communications, outreach, and education. But in order to target those individual elements of the program, you need to know where lead is. And the subtlety in Denver is that the service line is owned fully by the customer. So it's not surprising that there wasn't a lot of good information available at the time the inventory was built by Corona. So switching this into a predictive model, we wanted to know, and we needed to know, the likelihood and consequence of finding lead at an individual property. So Denver Water estimates that there are about 64,000 to 84,000 lead services in their water system. That is a wide range in itself and a big number as well. The lead reduction program targets approximately 5,000 service replacements a year, and it means that all those lead services will be replaced in about 15 years. So with this number of lead service lines, as well as the goal for annual replacements, which is an aggressive goal, we needed a predictive model to both prioritize our efforts to find lead, but also ultimately to prioritize the efforts to replace the lead as well. So building a predictive model. I am not a data expert. I am definitely an expert in water quality and distribution systems, and so we're going to try and merge the two together. And I work with a team to help build the model, obviously. So what is a machine learning, or what's a predictive model? Well, it's a tool to look for patterns in the data to develop the rules or the algorithms to thus analyze the data. So the predictive model learns from patterns in the data and then assigns a classification, i.e., will we find lead at a given address? The model is built using an additional data set, and that's our initial inventory. And then it's trained using another data set. And in this case, we're using data from the field to train the model. The model is continuously trained because with each program year as it advances, we get more data about what we're finding in the field, and that is then inputted back into the model so we can run another iteration. So we're using the predictive model both to efficiently build and update the inventory, but then we add this layer of prioritization to actually action the inventory and replace the lead. So the context for building the predictive model in Denver really stemmed from the fact that there was a lot of uncertainty in the inventory. Yes, there were 64,000 to 84,000 lead service estimated, but there would have been less than 2,000 services that were confirmed for lead out of that estimate. The inventory had to be built quickly. We had less than 4 months to take the initial inventory and convert it to a predictive model to support the request for variance to EPA to promote the lead reduction program. And because of the sheer volume of numbers involved, we use a predictive model to allow us to systematically check the rules and assumptions as we refined the information in the model and the inventory. And it's the predictive model that allowed us to focus where to go in the field, to look for data, to do some sampling, to do some potholes, and prioritize activities to better improve the model overall, and to do so quickly. So the initial inventory was based on a lot of desktop information, and it also, again, requires a team to know the water system. When was lead used? When was it discontinued? When was lead solder used? How did the city develop in terms of the housing stock? It's also knowing, where are there partial replacements? When were partial replacements banned? As well as the link to other assets and infrastructure in the system, including water mains. And so we take all this data and we build the initial inventory, and that's the starting point or the launch pad for the predictive model. I also want to emphasize just how much data is involved. In the example of Denver Water, they've got 1.4 million customers, as I've mentioned, 350,000 service connections. But add to that, as we're trying to figure out the likelihood of finding a lead service, there could be up to 30 attributes available for each connection. Not all of them are going to be used, not all of them are consequential, but we're reviewing that much data to try and better understand the inventory. And so the predictive model allows us to systematically review each property against the available data and the rules, and then to respond quickly to new rules as they come up, or not come up, but as we think them through, as well as the data assumptions. So the important thing, and Eric mentioned this as well, is the need to train the predictive model. So how did we do that? So we collected additional data that we were able to use to compare the model against the initial data set. And so this is a training data we had We're trying to do 2,000 investigations a year to build the model moving in the future, but for last year, what we were using were results from water quality sampling obtained from customer samples, as well as potholes that were done in the field. And we also did additional record review looking at acid data, water main build records, microfiche data, all with the goal of improving the understanding of the inventory, and also to run successive iterations of the model to improve the certainty in the data that's being projected. So what does this look like? This is a SAMKey drawing. It is not specific to a lead service inventory, but it's a great way to communicate data and how data sets change over time. And working from the left-hand side of the screen, we've got the increasing likelihood of finding lead down, going from top to bottom on the screen, as indicated from numbers 0 to 1. You could interpret that as a probability of finding lead. As you go along the bottom of the slide, you're seeing LSI 1, 2, 3. So these are successive inventories that were run with the model. And what we're trying to do, if you think of a bell curve, at the start of the inventory, the bulk of our properties were in what I call the mushy middle. And so there was a likelihood of finding lead, but we didn't have 100% certainty, or there wasn't visual confirmation that there was lead. And so there are fewer numbers of properties with known lead and at the other extreme of non-lead. And so what we're doing with the reiterations of the predictive model, with the updating with the additional data, is moving those data points, those properties that are in the mushy middle, out to the extremes, so that you have more and more of your properties, when all is said and done, either being classified as having a known lead service or classified as having non-lead. And that's what this drawing is trying to depict, and the squiggly lines are the details showing how a property is moving from one category or one probability of lead to another. So let's go from the model, the predictive model, and go to results, focusing on prioritization and where to do the work first, basically. So high level, we use the predictive model to prioritize the communications, outreach, and education activities to make sure that people were getting the message about the lead reduction program. Also use the predictive model and prioritization to manage how filter distribution would be performed, as well as where lead replacement would be performed, because when you have a 15-year program, you can't obviously get to all customers in one year, obviously, and there's just the volume of work is just too much. So how did we do this, and why did we do this? As I said, we're really interested in trying to improve public health and identify those at most risk to lead exposure. However, we also want to be responsible about the work in the sense of coordinate planning with other infrastructure projects and look for opportunities to realize construction efficiencies. We also don't want to go to the same street twice and rip it up multiple times, and we don't want to go back and forth to the same street, doing one neighbor, come back a year later, do the next neighbor. We want to be a bit more organized in terms of the replacements. So what did we do to the predictive model to allow us to prioritize the work? Well, we overlaid demographic and socioeconomic data, and we're specifically looking for properties or areas with a high risk for lead in drinking water in terms of water quality results, as well as those properties and areas with a high consequence from lead exposure. So we were using WIC data, so women, infant, and children data, so that we could identify where likely there are areas of children, infants, as those are the parts of the community that are most at risk. In terms of what a schedule of events would look like for what, in terms of taking the predictive model and making it into a prioritization model, we used a very consistent way of going through, here's our predictive likelihood of finding lead. What are the factors that'll influence the priority of risk and exposure, calculating a score for priority and ranking areas and bringing them together on a geographic basis. So not just looking at individual homes, but looking at blocks and areas using census tract data, and then starting to look at the data. Well, what other construction efforts are happening in the same area, paving programs, water main replacement, and can we find synergies? And then schedule the work. But you can see that it does start with a risk priority followed by the infrastructure programming. So what does this look like on the ground for Denver? So what you see in front of you is the application of the predictive model coupled with the prioritization, and we looked for neighborhoods and areas that would deliver the most improvements for public health protection. So the greatest number of lead service replacements, the highest risk and consequence, or risk for lead and consequence to that lead exposure. And we generated, we found a bunch of areas, obviously, but then we generated these data sheets so that we could really look at the socioeconomic data so we could address health equity issues. And the one on the right is representative of the area, what's represented by the green box on the map on the left. And through this way, we could look at the data, but we could also apply a judgment factor, say, okay, this makes sense. This is in terms of the development of the city and the housing stock and the neighborhoods and the makeup of the neighborhoods. Yep, this makes sense in terms of where we should go first. We did a similar exercise, so I should say this represents the long list of alternatives that we looked for neighborhoods to be working on in year one, and it was reduced to a short list because you get to 5,000 lead service line replacements for your 2020 plan pretty quickly. We did a similar exercise to focus on the prioritization of filter distribution. Again, filters are being used as an intermeasure to protect risk from lead exposure until the lead service line can be replaced. We had a greater number of properties included in the filter program, and we had to deliver those filters in a much shorter time. So rather than 15 years, we're looking at 10 weeks in terms of getting the filters to the customers. And so same model was applied, again, focusing on communities of at risk by using the women, infant, and children data set, looking at lead levels, looking at demographics in the city, and thus this map was created to focus on where do we go first to bring those filters and then distribute them over the 10-week period. So who should use a predictive model? I think that's a really important question. When you start to see all these charts and maps and data, and when I talk about how much data is involved, this is not a simple desktop exercise by any means. And I think the questions that have to be asked when you're deciding whether or not this is a relevant tool for you is, think about the scalability of it. Think about how many service connections are in the community and how much is known or not known about the lead use in the system. Is it efficient for a small system with a low number of lead services? Probably not if there's only 200 lead services left. How scalable is this? How long is the program? Is there a benefit to prioritizing the replacements over multiple years of the program? Is there enough data to train the model? And are there, importantly, resources available to support all the data handling and management that's needed to use the predictive and prioritization model? There may be other drivers as well, including how the outcomes are messaged to the public, as well as a need to address health equity and environmental justice in communities as well. So not a simple yes/no answer, but I will say probably the larger systems, 20,000 or more, would benefit from a predictive modeling and prioritization approach. I often get asked questions in terms of, when will my inventory be complete, or when will it be perfect? And the answer is, it's not, and it's not going to be perfect soon. And the reason being, it takes time to understand what's happening with the lead that was originally used in the system and has been removed over time, and particularly when you're dealing with the privately owned service connections. So we do feel that the confidence in the inventory for Denver is improving, but it will be a couple of years before there is that we can narrow down that window of 64,000 to 84,000 lead services in the community to something a little with a less, a smaller error band, I would say. Other questions I get asked is, well, how do you vet the assumptions used in the model? And when we're training the model, we can start to see which parameters are effective and which ones really aren't, don't allow us to differentiate from one property to another. So it is using logic to navigate some of the assumptions. I'm also asked, can we use the model to find partial lead services remaining on the private side? I'm going to suggest yes, because that should be comparable to the full service line. But galvanized does get tricky, and again, it comes down to what tools we have available to supplement the initial inventory with data in the field. And then the question is, when is this approach worthwhile? Because I think that really is the bigger question. And I would say there's two scenarios. The first is, if you want to better understand the inventory, you can use a model. And there's a second scenario, which is if you actually want help with prioritizing the actioning of the model, prioritizing how you go about replacing the service lines in the community. And it's also a great tool to communicate to the public why one neighborhood is being targeted first compared to another. So in terms of Denver Water's use of the predictive model and prioritization, we'll say that they now have a database that was originally based on statistical tools that is being used to plan the replacement based on machine learning and a predictive model. And the beauty of this is that we're able to integrate a lot of data to understand where the likelihood of lead might be. We then took a risk-based prioritization model to consider both the likelihood of lead and the consequence of lead, and then drilled that down to the more vulnerable community members to see where we wanted to recommend working first. We also took the data from the predictive model and prioritization to develop an overall implementation plan so that we can optimize construction efficiency, field investigations, data integration as a whole, replacement of the lead services, and implement the program. And so by using the predictive and prioritization model, we're able to realize public health benefits sooner for all customers. And with that, I am happy to pass it back to Wendy.
Excellent. Thanks, Corrine. And I'm going to go ahead and change over to our final presenter, Erica with 120 Water. Take it away.
Fantastic. Thank you, Wendy. Let's get us set up here. All right. Am I looking good? Can you see me?
Yes, you're good. Thank you.
Excellent. All right. Well, first of all, thanks everyone for joining us. I hope all of you, your families, your colleagues are physically and emotionally well right now. To all our utility folks that I see joining us on the webinar, thanks so much for keeping the clean water flowing in and dirty water flowing out so we can all try to beat this thing by staying at home. Appreciate you. Thanks as well to ASDA for having me and tailored presenters for sharing their expertise and experience. I think it's really helpful to hear these stories as we all look at ways of finding and removing lead lines in our communities. And I say we really intentionally because it's going to take a collaborative group of thoughtful policymakers and technology firms and engineers and engaged citizens to get this work done. I think some of you likely have heard of 120 Water for some of the work that we're doing with lead testing in schools and childcare facilities and with lead and copper rule compliance sampling, but I'm really looking forward to talking with you about another way that we'd like to help states and utilities reduce lead in drinking water. In the next 20-ish or less than minutes, I'll talk about the tools that our team has built and that we're continuing to refine as we work with cities that are either replacing lines proactively or are preparing for the lead and copper rule revisions. I am an environmental scientist by training and not a data scientist, and so in addition to explaining how our tools work, I'll also just talk about the overall value and practical application of predictive modeling for LSL inventories. But before we go there, I would like to step back a bit briefly. So the first and most challenging aspect of identifying LSLs for many cities is narrowing down when their colleagues of the past exactly put them in the ground. And it doesn't help that we're working with nearly a 200-year timeline. We know from historical records that lead pipes were a popular choice in American cities in the early 1800s, and though some cities started moving away from their use in the 1930s, as we began to fully understand the really serious health risks, there were groups like the Lead Industries Association that degraded this progress by launching successful national campaigns to actively promote the use of lead in drinking water systems, really up until the 1970s. Plumbing codes, as others on the webinar talked about, started to prohibit lead lines in 1977, and then of course in 1988 the EPA's ban on lead pipes went into effect, effectively giving us all a year to work back from. But though we see downward trends in a number of Midwestern areas in the 50s and 60s, many cities just don't know where they fall in this timeline, and much of their residential development may have occurred well before the ban. So, of course, during much of this 200-year timeline, utilities manage infrastructure information on paper. And so in addition to this being a health threat, LSLs are also fundamentally a data problem. And I think the other speakers did a really great job of talking about that already, but I will hit it home as well. So when I was in graduate school here in Southern Indiana, my local utility was interested in finding LSLs and asked me to assist them with some profile sampling. We started with the records. They had a GIS system with all their lateral assets neatly mapped. We had main install dates and lots of other useful information, but the service line material data was super sparse. They also handed me a notepad from a retired administrative assistant named Ethel. And on several of those notebook pages, Ethel had neatly written down historical lead service line replacements at about 50 homes. So we took what she had given us and we went from there. Many utilities know where service lines are, but not what they are made of. And this can be expensive to fill the informational gap. I think it's worth briefly talking about the numbers here because it speaks to the value of the approach that some of us here are advocating for. I'll be using estimates and ranges, but this just gives us a sense of the scale. Our best national estimates put the total number of LSLs in the country at between $6 and $10 million, or million lines. To confirm flood service lines, we've heard hydrovacing can cost between $200 and $400 on average, and then excavation can cost more, though both can cost a lot more depending on the site. So taking these numbers, because it's what we have to work with, we could be looking at between $1 and $20 billion just to identify our estimated flood service lines. Of course, in reality, many systems would have to dig many more times to actually find lines. Moving forward, if the country continues to move toward total replacement, we could then be looking at an additional $9 to $50 billion. And with $1 trillion in identified needs in other drinking water infrastructure areas, we simply have to find efficient ways of filling data gaps and prioritizing replacements over time. So over a year ago, we started developing a predictive algorithm based on data from a handful of cities in the Midwest and East Coast. And taking what we learned through this effort, we identified the most common and important predictors of LSLs in those cities, and then we started looking for a way to standardize the inventorying process so that utilities who are light on data and resources would have at least a way to start this process and then to prioritize their efforts. Of course, construction year has continually been one of the most important variables, but others have helped us narrow down the timeline and hone in on the neighborhoods where lead service lines were historically used. We're in quite a few conversations with systems that have been paying attention to the lead and copper rule revisions, and then many are sort of in the early planning stages. They're looking at the data they have in-house, and they're thinking about how they would tackle an inventory as well as some of the other requirements like school and childcare sampling. And I've been really impressed by how proactive some of these systems want to be. Right now, we're also currently hosting a larger pilot with 6 or 7 of our existing customers. Unfortunately, COVID has slowed down some of those efforts, but I really look forward to sharing more of our results later with you in the year. Fundamentally, we start by figuring out what the utility knows. Currently, if a city has a robust number of service lines with confirmed material types, including lead lines, then we start there. If they have no data or sparse data, we randomly assign locations and ask the system to collect some observations that are representative for us. We ask for addresses that are clearly defined through LSL parameters, and then a number of other fields like pipe diameter. Once we have this infrastructure data, we match each service line address with tax parcel data that we call from other APIs, which just means that we can share data back and forth with other systems. In terms of the modeling itself, today we use decision trees and sometimes spatial analysis. These algorithms are applied to our training data set, as everyone else explained, and then we generate LSL probabilities for each property with an unknown service line material type. You can look at the probabilities either with heat maps or by property. Once the utility has those probabilities for its service area, it can validate or invalidate them. And then after a certain number of validations, we retune and rerun the model, as others have discussed. So ideally, this is a tool to generate a preliminary inventory, and then if properly updated and maintained, the predictions within that inventory get better as teams fill in data gaps over time, either strategically or through normal operations and projects. Behind the scenes, we work with our data scientists to monitor and retune the algorithm periodically within our software. And as I mentioned, we see inventorying and specifically predictive analytics as a first step for at least medium and large cities. And so I'll talk about how we see this tool fitting into the larger effort of lead service line replacement. So this tool is part of our lead service line software, which provides a mechanism for managing inventories and replacement work in customer communication and sampling across one or many systems. For many cities, lead service line management would be a 5 to 20-year effort. And this is true even in states like Wisconsin, with over a decade of reporting on inventories and a really robust and helpful funding structure for both private and public side replacement. But a lot can happen in 20 years. Project staff can retire and regulations can change. And so we feel it's really important to get the processes and tools in place from the very beginning. This is the only visual I'm going to give you of our software because this isn't a demo, but I've included it here to make an overall statement about our approach. Based on the legislative trends and continued public attention to lead in drinking water, we believe the issue of lead service lines is not going away and that systems will eventually be required to replace them. This is, of course, also the right thing to do. But with all of the other priorities that utilities are juggling, we also know it's important to treat this work as ongoing but strategic and to target inventory updates and replacements in places most likely to have lead lines or in neighborhoods and homes with the most vulnerable populations. For us, in situations where a city needs more assistance with their records review or wants more nuanced and detailed modeling work done, we'll currently reach out to our existing outside partners. This is also true for the actual replacement work. We aren't engineering or construction experts, and we lean on our network there again. And again, as I said at the beginning of this presentation, I think it's going to be a collaborative effort. I'm going to talk about each of the 4 stages on our timeline here below because they relate to the building and utilization of predictive modeling. The first and often the most painful step is figuring out what data utility has. Just like my experience with Ethel's notebook, infrastructure data is often spread around in a few sources and probably understood best by a handful of people. Our initial planning meetings about this work often include between 4 and 6 people. They're GIS or transmission distribution experts, compliance managers, or really just staff who've been there the longest and have the best memories. Service line material types broken down into public and private components, install years for laterals and mains, and pipe diameters are all really good places to start. Some of our partners have also identified valuable information in work order systems and documents about old contracting work. And it's possible that lead use may also follow the contractor's route to some extent. In addition to the utility-owned data, tax parcel information, as others have said, can help cities know where to aim, as can local plumbing guidelines and ordinances, as I mentioned earlier. It's likely that other city offices have helpful data squirreled away in silos somewhere, and pulling this information out is really key to the predictive approach. Our customers are using or planning to use this information in a variety of ways as they take the next step of completing their inventory or scheduling replacements. In a few cases, we're going to be able to take advantage of planned replacement work like meter changeout programs or main replacement to capture service line validation. Lead check swabs Profile sampling or scratch test instructions are also common verification methods. These are not as expensive as hydrovacking or digging, though sometimes they're also not as thorough or conclusive. We facilitate water testing as well, and we're seeing some interest in multi-metals analysis since the cost of running additional metals on the same sample is not wildly different, and understanding concentrations of zinc, copper, and tin across a profile could provide a fuller picture. I think as everyone can appreciate on the webinar today, single liter samples are not very helpful for this work. Swabs were helpful in helping schools and childcare facilities narrow down leaded components in their plumbing infrastructure in the states that we work in. And I also have used them on service lines as well. Actually, the picture to the left is from an early test run I did with the pipe my operator certification instructor gifted me. Obviously, no one should be entering homes at the present moment, but the utilities that we work with are interested in involving customers in the inventory update process where they can. We work with customers directly on LCR sampling, and I think any utility on the call knows how challenging it can be to get water samples collected and collected correctly. I do think it would be challenging to get a non-water professional to take a profile sample, but we see positive results with visual inspections via photos, scratch tests, or swabs on the visible portion of a service line. These are all reasonable ways to include customers and to save staff some time. Utilities often cite issues with getting customers to participate in the inventory and replacement projects, and we see marketing campaigns helping a bit with this. There's even some interest in using probabilities, mailers with messaging like, our records suggest your home has a 90% chance of having an LFL. We would like your help in confirming this. Whatever method is used, thoughtful validation is critical to the long-term value of the predictive approach, and it directly impacts its overall accuracy and usefulness. Moving along our timeline, the next phase we can talk about is prioritization. Certainly, the predictions themselves can be used to determine where inventory updates or replacement efforts should be focused. This can be as simple as picking prediction thresholds or concentrating efforts in entire neighborhoods with the greatest and highest density of higher probabilities. We don't and aren't including demographic data, water, or blood testing results in our algorithm, but we do collect it and we encourage its use in prioritizing where work is done. These parameters should be layered over predictions because this is how you ensure your organization is doing its utmost to reduce lead in an equitable way. And I do think socioeconomics is somewhat inherent in the types of data used in predictive modeling like this, but I definitely encourage everyone to consider this issue really carefully. Ultimately, predictions can be used to guide replacement work in a few ways, and we work with clients that set a firm target, say replacing all lines within 2 years, or clients that mostly want to track the inventory and take it into account as they make plans about future updates to their infrastructure. Again, we're finding that outreach and marketing are important and that predictions may help communicate a sense of importance or urgency. A communication strategy for this kind of work is also a good way to make the case for the overall value of replacement. And this slide isn't directly about predictive modeling, but it's important and I hope it'll resonate. The cost of inventorying and replacement are somewhat well understood, but we will all need to do a better job of talking about the benefits of getting lead pipes out of our communities. Some cities like Cincinnati are getting out there and setting the example through marketing and public events. We assist the city of Newark on the sampling portion of their lead service line replacement program, and they're working to replace about 16,000 lead lines within the next few years. And they're out in the community talking about the number of people they've hired to help them carry out replacement as well as the health benefits. There are also a number of cost-benefit analyses that can be used to help make the case. I put this little story problem together with estimated average counts of lead service lines in my own state for small systems, and then used a report from the state of Minnesota, which estimated $10 in IQ-related benefits alone for every $1 spent on lead service line replacement. And you can see that in this scenario, the average community in Indiana could be bringing $10 to $27 million in benefits to their city if they were to remove lead service lines. So here's the tie-in. Inventorying is helpful in terms of understanding how many lead service lines are present, but it's also the key to understanding the potential cost and benefits that replacement would bring. I'll end here with some of the early lessons that we're learning today as we continue to refine our tool and work with our pilot partners. For our approach, we're seeing 3 common issues. The first is that systems may not have clearly defined what constitutes a lead service line, which means they may leave out lines with leaded components during the inventorying process. ASDOA has a really helpful paper outlining the way I think 4 states have approached lead service line inventorying requirements, and they make some suggestions for definitions. We've developed our own very similar definitions, and we have translated those into the fields that we request. And we found it's well worth the effort early on to sit down and agree upon those terms. I look forward to seeing what clarity EPA and states bring to this part of the conversation as folks prepare to meet the requirements of the lead and copper rule revisions. For predictive modeling, though, you will get out of it what you put into it. Bad data in, bad data out. So in addition to clearly defining what you classify as a lead service line, it's important to identify which sources of truth you will accept. We think visual inspections, tap cards, and possibly careful profile sampling are the best inputs, and in that order. Sometimes we see pre-filtered lists of likely lines and then discover they were based on home age and not material type data, and this can't be used to train models. Inconsistent data is another issue we also see. Essentially, everyone on the LSL team needs to be committed to identifying lines whenever and wherever the opportunity presents itself, and providing data about what they found in a consistent way. We capture this in software, but I see teams use work order systems and various apps. Essentially take advantage of all opportunities to validate or invalidate predictions, and it's helpful to outline an overall data management strategy early on. And with that, I'd like to thank our data science and engineering team at 120 Water for all their hard work, and thanks to all of you for tuning in, and I'll hand it back over to Wendy.
Excellent. Thank you, Erica. So we'll now move into the Q&A session, and I've received a few questions already through the question box, but please continue to send in those questions if you have them. Okay, so with that, I'll start off with some of the questions for Eric Oswald in Michigan. There are a few questions about the approach Michigan took to their lead service line inventory. So there's a question if the inventory was mandatory for municipalities, and then a question on if the known galvanized previously connected to lead category, if that included lead goosenecks, pigtails, and or connectors.
Yeah, that's a good question. And this, it is a requirement under our lead and copper rule for all community water systems and non-transient water community, or non-transient non-community water systems, to do the inventory. And you saw the initial results there. I will say that, yeah, our definition of a lead service line includes galvanized previously connected to lead, and that does include goosenecks. So goosenecks are included in that definition, and it goes 18 inches into the home. So whatever is after that 18 inches belongs to the homeowner and not the water utility. The only thing we excluded after extensive conversation with stakeholders were things like corporation fittings and things like that. So we're only looking at the big issue is the goosenecks. And again, we don't expect systems to excavate every single lead service line, which is why some of these predictive tools are so important. They need to prove to us that they've done a statistical analysis and they have a reasonably good assurance that they know where the lead is in their system. But we know we're not going to get to 100%. It just, as some of the numbers that were thrown out there by Eric were, it would bankrupt us to try and excavate every inch of every line. And I will tell you, there are communities where leadership is actually calling for that. The mayors and whatnot want every inch of every line because they don't want any lead left in the ground. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, that's great. And then Eric Schwartz, we had a couple of questions about some of the work in Flint. And so we had a question on what the false negative rate was in your work in Flint.
Sure. One interesting thing about thinking about the predictions here is the false positive and false negative rate is what you want to ask if you are making a prediction once and only once, and you never get a chance to revisit it. And also, if you make all of your decisions about every home that moment. And so actually the false positive, false negative rates are a little different in the way that you want to think about them. In fact, one of the better way to think about it is you have a long rank ordering of homes, and you're going to put the ones with highest probability at the top and lowest probability at the bottom. And you want to know, how good is that list? What's the quality of that list? And so one of the ways to measure that is there's a score that essentially says if I take a randomly selected lead home and a randomly selected non-lead home, and I ask the model to decide which is which should be 50-50 no matter how much lead you have, how good is the model at determining that? Which has a higher probability? And in that case, our models by the end were well over 94-95% on that score. And that's something that's known as the area, the AUROC score. So that's a method that people use because just looking at false positive, false negative isn't really the way that these are being used. That's the way it's sometimes being used from a kind of medical diagnostic perspective, where you have to decide each patient today, is this patient going to have the disease or not? Then you really want to know the false positive, false negative.
Okay, and then a follow-up question from that was they wanted to hear more about specifically how the predictive model used in Flint was used to minimize the unnecessary excavation of service lines. So for example, those lines that were ultimately found to be made of acceptable materials such as copper. And Eric, if you want to weigh in first, and then maybe we can go to Karina and Erica if they have thoughts as well.
Sure. Well, one of the things, one thing we don't do ever is to just with a model declare this home is lead free. That's something that we just kind of, the way that we've applied these statistics and machine learning methods, we will say that it has a very low probability or a lower probability. And so when we say we were able to save unnecessary digs, what we're saying is we are kind of thinking about the percentage of times that you went to try to replace lead, and while trying to excavate to find lead, your crews found copper. That's a kind of confirmed unnecessary dig. Now, inevitably, some of those are going to happen, but the question is, you want to reduce those. And so the way that we were able to reduce those is we gave that list rank ordered by probabilities and pretty much said, all right, in this neighborhood, go to the top of this list because these all have the highest probability of actually being lead. And as a result, the number of digs that they actually had to do, which came up copper, was reduced. And in that way, we were able to use the predictive model to dramatically reduce the number of unnecessary digs without necessarily declaring certain homes to have copper definitely, we're not doing that.
I'm just going to
Any
jump
of the
in
other
there.
panelists? Oh,
Yeah, sure.
Perfect.
This is Karine. So I think the key here is to triangulate the different data sources, right? The field data, the model predictions, the historical records. And what you're looking for ultimately is visual confirmation of the material of the service line. So when you get to a property, you kind of have a workflow in place in mind in terms of how the field crews are going to proceed based on the information at hand. And there's gate points along the way to say, we need more information, we're going to dig, we're not going to dig, and so that helps with reducing unnecessary excavations. So you're following a sequence of steps. You're looking for anomalies or conflicts in the data. If you're doing potholing, you don't see lead, yet your water quality results that was collected previously suggest that there is lead. You keep exploring and you keep asking the question until you get all your different data sources lined up.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I would add to their excellent answers that a lot of times what I hear is folks are really starting with their intuition. Well, I know that, you know, Smithville neighborhood is the oldest. And so their first plan, if they weren't to use a sort of data-driven approach, would just be to grab a backhoe and start digging up yards. And like Eric said, you know, these are predictions and probabilities. It is not a declarative statement, but it is a way from preventing unnecessary digs that are very costly. So the goal really here is prioritization and the thoughtful strategy.
Great. We've also had a few questions come in about timing. And Erica, I know you mentioned in your presentation about the 1 to 5 year effort for kind of building the inventory. But a few questions on, you know, how long it should the process take to develop an entire inventory, especially when you're starting with minimal data. And a few questions on what the timing was for Denver and Flint. So maybe Erica, if you want to expand, and then we'll go to Karine and Eric.
Yeah, well, I guess first I would say if the mandatory inventory that's required by the lead and copper rule revisions goes into effect, I believe all utilities would have to submit, or community water systems over a certain size would have to submit their first inventory for review by the state in either summer or fall of 2023. So keeping that timeline in place, I mean, you know, I think this effort, if done correctly, a careful review of those records, and then time to give the predictive model through careful updates, time to improve so that it can be used for strategies, I would say a year at least is ideal. Not mandatory, but ideal.
So in the case of Denver, we jumped on board with the predictive model after the initial inventory had already been built. So, and I'm assuming that was about a 9-month effort before we got there. And then with the predictive model, it's definitely been another 9 months since then, but the map was posted about 4 months after the predictive model was created. But keep in mind, there's constant evolution with that. And I think the other answer to that question is that it really depends on the size of the community and the number of service connections and the use of lead in the system as well. So it's not an overnight solution, that's for sure. But I think you start with what is your best understanding of the model or the inventory initially, and then as you fine tune it and get more information as it gets, you get more confidence in the data, that takes more time. But how much do you need initially to know when you're going to start replacing service lines?
And was that to me, or should it go to Eric Oswald? Wendy?
Either of you could answer.
All right, I'll take a stab at this. From our experience, perhaps just because we're the way in which we've been running and building these models for quite some time. When we started in Flint, we were there wasn't much of an initial inventory. There were some historical records, but we were kind of there from ground zero. And as the data were accumulating and we had live access to that data, we were able to build the model within a month or a couple of months. And actually, after a few months, just that first kind of construction season we were involved, the predictions started stabilizing, and the estimates started stabilizing. And so even though we continued to be involved beyond 2016 through 2019, and the model continued to improve, and the results continued to, when the model was being used, continued to improve, the actual kind of core model and the core predictions started being useful in a matter of a month or two in September, October 2016. In other communities where we've worked, it's really just dependent on where the conditions of the data, the actual kind of each time the model has to be recalibrated, and it's a lot of kind of sometimes referred to as data munging or data janitorial work or data wrangling to make sure that things are in the right formats and digitized appropriately. But from cleaned up data to predictions, that's a real short process to start validating. We're talking a month or two, but as time goes on, it continuously improves, and sometimes you want to see it bear out in the field in different ways for different amounts of time. So it's really just a matter of construction schedule and data availability.
Okay, thanks. And Eric Oswald, we have a question here for you. Eric Schwartz mentioned that Michigan Eagle and US EPA have approved the predictive lead service line inventory work in Flint. Were there any special reviews or considerations given to predictive models in meeting the state requirements for the lead inventory rule? And kind of a follow-up to that is do you think that the proposed revisions to EPA's LCR will accept predictive model results for inventory purposes?
Yeah, that's tricky from the state's perspective. We certainly want to see some amount of field validation go into these predictive models. You know, we're obviously not going to just accept, hey, the predictive model says, as Eric pointed out, that there's no lead there. We want to see some field validation and a statistically significant amount of field validation, whether it be hydro excavation or knifing or whatever method that they employ there. And again, we want to see something like, you know, we want it at the curb box, we want it inside, and that way, if it's copper and copper, we have a good indication that it's a copper line. So yeah, it's going to be tricky, and we're still working on those. You can tell, you know, we gave our systems basically a year and a half to get their preliminary done, and there was a lot of gnashing of teeth about that was too quick. And now we're giving them 5 years to validate that initial inventory. And it's important to note that our 5% average removal of lead service lines starts next year. But ours is adjustable, unlike EPA's, where I think, you know, once you set your unknowns, those are all counted as lead service lines, and they count against your 3% that you've got to hit in certain circumstances. With our rule, we're going to allow our systems to adjust their inventory of lead service lines, so those unknowns are not automatically locked into lead. As they do better and they nail down their validated inventory, we'll reduce the number of lead service lines or increase depending on what the case is. But it's very tricky to just use predictive tools, and we've got to come up. We're not there yet, quite frankly, in all transparency. We've got a lot more work to do, but we'll definitely be working with other groups to make sure we've got a scientifically based method for doing that.
Yeah, and that's one thing. Just Eric Schwartz here jumping in. You know, at the time when we had submitted things for Flint, the question was really out: how many service lines do you expect to be lead? And the best guessed answer could be done in many ways. And we provided an explanation of how it and why it was done through a pretty, at that point, simple and easy to explain predictive approach. and that's what kind of went through the levels of government at the time. But I think what I just want to echo what Eric Oswald is saying, and it goes back to, I think, point number 5 in our slides, which is coming up, and I think it may be a part of this group here that cares about advancing these methods, to come up with a unified set of criteria whereby a state agency or some governing body can look at the analysis and look at the results and reports and say, all right, it checks these boxes. You've done appropriate holdout validation on real data. You've demonstrated that you can provide the data and the code for another group to reproduce this. I think these are the kinds of things that in other technical and data-driven communities, especially if there's a push towards openness and public transparency, these are the kinds of practices and requirements that exist. So it would be interesting to explore those with others.
This is Karine. I just want to jump in and say, because our water systems weren't all built in one day, and they surely have not been maintained all in one day, we have a lot of inconsistencies with the different water systems. And so when we were doing the predictive model for Denver, we had a lot of conversations about how many investigations do we need to do each year to improve the model. And it ranged all over the place. And where we landed is that we will do about 2,000 investigations in the early years of the program. And then reduce that down to closer to 1,000 per year. But results generated or associated with lead service line replacement, be it water quality sampling or potholing before replacement, do not count towards those investigations. So you have both a dedicated investigation program as well as the information you're getting as you replace the lead services. So for Denver, that could be over 10,000, over 7,000 data points that are added each year into the inventory to improve the inventory. So just some context.
All right, excellent. Well, we're now at the conclusion of the webinar, and I want to take a moment to thank all of our panelists for the excellent presentations and all of our attendees for the great questions. We did not get to all of the questions. I think this area is ripe for continued follow-up. I'm going to explore maybe some different ways that we could either address some of the questions that were asked that we didn't get a chance to answer, and maybe even putting together some of the ones we did answer and having an opportunity to explain that further. Kind of as Eric Schwartz mentioned, there's opportunity here to build some principles up that we can all agree on, and so I think there will be a lot of continued work in this. I don't know about you guys, but this was a nice break for me from coronavirus related issues. So I never thought I'd say I'd be happy to talk about lead service lines at length, but this was really excellent. So as a reminder, this webinar will be available on the ASDL website for future viewing. And with that, I bid you all adieu and wish everybody a very happy weekend. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good weekend.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.